Once upon a time, in a small, weather beaten town nestled between mountains and rivers, there lived a man named Arthur. Unlike most people, Arthur was content in his solitude. For years, he had resided alone in an old, creaky cabin on the outskirts of town, away from the noise and hustle of modern life. The cabin had been his grandfather's, passed down through the family, but no one else seemed to want it. It was too far from civilization, too remote for those who preferred the convenience of the town's markets, streets, and social circles. But to Arthur, this isolation was a sanctuary. Arthur was in his mid 40s, a tall, wiry man with deep set eyes that spoke of wisdom gained through a life of quiet reflection. He made a living by carving intricate wooden sculptures, which he sold at the town's weekend market. His hands, rough and calloused from years of work, had a tenderness to them when they gripped a block of wood, knowing just where to cut, how to shape the material into lifelike forms. Birds in mid flight, deer frozen in a graceful leap, or faces of people he had once known. The locals admired his craftsmanship, and his art fetched a decent price. Still, Arthur remained distant. He never lingered long in town after his sales, avoiding long conversations, always retreating back to his cabin. To some, Arthur was a mystery. Children whispered that he was a hermit, a magician, or even a ghost. Adults speculated that he had suffered a great loss, perhaps a love gone wrong, or some terrible tragedy that had driven him into isolation. Yet no one dared ask, for Arthur's silence carried with it an air of impenetrable strength, as if words were unnecessary in his world. The truth was, Arthur had once lived a very different life. Many years before, he had been a man of the city, a busy, ambitious architect with dreams of designing skyscrapers and sprawling urban landscapes. He had been married to a woman named Evelyn, the love of his life. They had shared dreams, hopes, and a beautiful little apartment in the heart of the city. But life has a way of tearing at the seams of even the most perfect plans. One rainy afternoon, Evelyn had been in a car accident. She never made it home. The grief consumed Arthur. The city that had once been vibrant and full of promise now felt like a cage. The noise, the crowds, the constant reminder of all he had lost became unbearable. Unable to cope with his sorrow, Arthur left everything behind: his career, his friends, and the life he had known. He retreated to his grandfather's cabin, where the silence was as thick as the mist that rolled down the mountains in the early morning. At first, the loneliness was a kind of torment. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the windows reminded him of his isolation. But over time, the stillness became his companion. The natural world around him, the trees, the river, animal, all of it, seemed to welcome him into a different kind of life, a slower, more contemplative existence. He learned to live with his grief, not by forgetting, but by accepting it as part of who he was. On a late autumn afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, casting Lund's shadows across the forest floor, Arthur noticed something unusual. A small, scruffy dog had appeared at the edge of his property, watching him from a distance. At first, Arthur paid it on mind, assuming it was a stray that would soon wander off. But the dog returned the next day, and the day after that, it never came close, always observing from afar, as if waiting for an invitation. Eventually, Arthur left bowl of water and some scraps of food outside his cabin. The dog cautiously approached, ate, and then disappeared again into the woods. This went on for several weeks, a quiet dance between man and animal, each respecting the other's space. Gradually, the dog began to trust Arthur, inching closer until one day It sat beside him as he worked on a carving. Arthur reached out, hesitated for a moment, and then gently patted its head. The dog closed its eyes and leaned into his hand. From that day on, the dog became Arthur's constant companion. He named it Scout. Together, they roamed the woods, explored hidden trails, and sat by the river watching the world go by. For the first time in years, Arthur felt a sense of connection, a bond that didn't require words or explanations. Scout had become a bridge between Arthur and the world, a reminder that even in solitude, companionship could find its way to him. The years passed, and Arthur's reputation as a master woodcarver grew. People from neighboring towns would come to buy his sculptures, and some even ventured out to his cabin, hoping to meet the man behind the art. Arthur was polite, but he never allowed anyone to stay long. His life of solitude had become a choice, not a burden, and he guarded it fiercely. Yet every now and then, when the wind rustled through the trees or the evening sky turned a deep shade of purple, Arthur would think of Evelyn. He would remember her laugh, her touch, and the life they had shared. But the ache had softened, transformed by time and the peace he had found in his quiet existence. He had learned that while the past could never be undone, the future was still open, even for a man who lived alone. In the end, Arthur's story was not one of sadness, but of resilience. He had built a new life, one of beauty and quiet contentment, far from the noise of the world, where he and Scout could live out their days in the stillness of the mountains.